Glucose. We know we need glucose for energy. We know our body needs to maintain this dynamic equilibrium, homeostasis, or balance. So we need to maintain glucose levels at that nice steady state. So our body is going to use that negative feedback, remember that response that will detect the change, respond, and then eventually shut itself off to keep the blood glucose levels steady. So we have two main hormones that work with each other that are actually considered to be opposing hormones. They're both coming from the pancreas, and the names are insulin and glucagon. Insulin is used to bring blood glucose levels down. So your body has detected that the blood glucose levels have gone up. Let's say you ate a meal that had a lot of sugar in it. You had a candy bar maybe. It detects that the blood glucose levels are high, and it's going to act in order to bring the blood glucose levels down. Nice tongue twister. So we sense that glucose level in the blood being high, and it's going to do two things. It's going to bring the glucose into the cells to be used for cellular respiration, for energy, and then extra glucose is going to be stored as that polysaccharide glycogen in the liver for later use. If we have an opposite situation, you wake up in the morning and you don't eat breakfast, your body is going to detect that your blood glucose levels are low, and glucagon is going to get released in order to increase your blood glucose levels. What that's going to do is it's going to release glycogen from the liver. Remember, that's our storage of starches in our liver. We're going to store it, well, polysaccharides, I should say. We're going to take glycogen and it's going to get released from the liver, and glucagon is going to be used in order to break that glucose down and bring the glucose into the cells. So it's going to get released from the liver, broken down into glucose, and the glucagon is going to be used in order to help us take that sugar into our cells. It's then going to be used for cellular respiration. These two hormones work together in order to maintain that dynamic equilibrium of blood sugar in our body. Remember, our liver is our target cell. We have receptors on the cell membranes for both insulin and glucagon. So let's look at the example for the human body in a little bit more detail. So remember, we want to maintain a normal blood glucose level. We're going to have a meal. That meal, let's say, is going to have carbohydrates in it, which are going to increase the levels of glucose in the blood. We're going to release insulin from our pancreas, and it's going to cause glucose to go into the cells, and any extra glucose to be brought into the liver as glycogen. Remember, that's that polysaccharide. It, in essence, will help us to bring our blood glucose back down to more normal levels. Let's say we don't have a meal. We woke up in the morning and didn't eat breakfast. We're going to have low glucose levels in the blood. We're going to release glucagon from our pancreas, which is going to cause glycogen to be released from the liver. It'll get broken down into glucose, and it will help to bring glucose levels up in the bloodstream so that we can then use that for energy and get it back to our normal levels. But let's say, what happens when we have a problem? Well, we've all heard of diabetes. We know we have problems with diabetes in our country these days. The problem is that the body can't use insulin to decrease the blood glucose levels. For whatever reason, either your body is not producing insulin or it's not responding to the insulin. We have a failure of homeostasis. This is considered to be a disease state. Anytime where we can't maintain homeostasis, it's considered to be some sort of a disorder. So there are two main types of diabetes. Type 1 diabetes typically is when you are diagnosed at a young age or born with it, and the cells in the pancreas are destroyed by the body. Sometimes we call this an autoimmune disease. Your body is actually attacking its own cells. The end effect is that we are not producing insulin in the body, or we're producing very, very low levels of insulin in the body to the point where there isn't enough at all for it to function. Type 2 diabetes is typically considered to be adult onset diabetes, and the problem comes out where the receptors on the target cells that it's supposed to bind to for insulin are not actually responding. So we have these receptors and they're resistant. They just don't respond to the insulin signal. So the body is producing insulin, but for whatever reason, the receptors aren't responding to the signal. So if we have a meal and we have sugar in the meal, and let's say for whatever reason we either don't have insulin or the receptors aren't responding to the insulin, the glucose levels are going to stay very high. There's no way to bring those glucose levels down because for whatever reason, either we don't have insulin or we're not responding to the insulin. Therefore, if you look at a graph of it, looking at glucose concentration, a person that has without diabetes would have a meal. That meal would give off a little bit of glucose if it has carbohydrates in it. And over time, as a result of the insulin being given off, the blood sugar levels would go back to a normal state. With someone with diabetes, though, unfortunately, they eat that meal. That meal has carbohydrates, and the glucose levels are going to stay high in the blood because the insulin is not working, isn't being produced in order to bring that blood sugar level back down. If you keep your blood sugar levels high for somebody that has diabetes, it can eventually cause some major problems in the body. It can stress some of the other organs out. Eventually, you can go into some sort of a diabetic shock or comas, depending on the situation that you may have. But in general, your body is not able to maintain homeostasis the way it's supposed to. A person who's living with diabetes, well, we start off with having to try to diagnose them with a disorder. We have to try to figure out if they actually have something. So we've identified a person that cannot regulate their blood glucose levels. Maybe they consistently are tired, they have headaches, they may have weight gain, all sorts of other problems. And we have to try to figure out some sort of a treatment. Essentially, we need to manage the disease. There's no cure for diabetes exactly at this point. One day we may have one. In terms of both types of diabetes, for type 1 diabetes, remember this is the kind that you're typically born with, where your pancreatic cells aren't producing insulin, they may be destroyed. You typically will need to take insulin shots or injections, and this is produced by something called transgenic bacteria. We've actually introduced the gene for humans to produce insulin into bacteria, and the bacteria then are programmed to make our own insulin for us. So it becomes a pure form of human insulin. In old days, and even still in some cases, in some situations, they used to actually harvest insulin from pig pancreas. Now we can actually use a nice pure form of human insulin. So remember, with type 1 diabetes, it's usually genetic. Sometimes it could be environmental, but it's usually a genetic disorder that you're born with, and you get that as a juvenile. Type 2 diabetes, you can sometimes treat it with diet and exercise, weight loss. Sometimes you may have to take some medication. It may even have to be controlled with insulin if the other situations can't control it. The diet piece is a big thing. Eating meals that are lower in sugars, especially refined sugars, like having lots of sweets and candies and desserts and things like that, and controlling your diet, controlling the amount of sugar you take into your body. This usually is typically an environmental thing. It's considered to be our adult onset. Sometimes as your body ages, though, sometimes your receptors just stop responding to the signals for the insulin. You become insulin resistant, they call it. And that can be caused by all sorts of other things. So this is how your body lives with diabetes, managed through diet, exercise, or even insulin.